Thank you so much. So good to be here. I'm Claudia, this is Chloe, and we have just finished working on a 6-part series called The Gasman, which is out wherever you get your podcasts. The last episode came out last week, so we're very happy to be here to talk to you about it, because it's very fresh in our minds. We've just finished working on it. I was a producer of the series, and Chloe was the reporter. That was a very good introduction. It was a series that kind of crossed a whole load of different subjects that we'll get into today. But I suppose the best starting point is where you, Chloe, found the story and kind of what we found so interesting about it and how we got into it.
So lots of people, when you do something like this, say, where do you get your ideas? And these ideas they do tend to sort of drop and materialize out of nowhere. And our job as journalists really is to spot them when they come along. And I was chatting to an old friend who I hadn't seen for a long time, and he told me that he had worked on a documentary about Iran's chemical weapons program back in the 80s, when Iran and Iraq were involved in a terrible, terrible war that lasted almost a decade. And his documentary was really about how Iran had suffered, was the victim of horrific chemical attacks, mostly perpetrated by Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And within his documentary, there was this tiny, tiny detail, which I really zoned in on, which was about this German man called Peter Walaschek, who had been involved in helping Iran start its own chemical weapons program. And he'd been caught and escaped and spent 30 years on the run. And when my friend found him in Germany and doorstepped him, this elderly man had tried to swing a punch at my friend and then very angrily marched him into a police station. And I was like, excuse me, what? This was a fugitive taking you into a police station? He said, yeah. He had absolutely no fear whatsoever of being arrested. And so immediately I was like, well, who is this man? How could he be on the run for 30 years and have no fear whatsoever of being caught? What's his story? So I found his number and gave him a call and said, can I come and interview you? And he said, why not? I've had a fascinating life. I've often thought about writing a book about my life. And I couldn't believe my luck. So me and Claudia got on a plane, and that's really where it all started.
And I think, I think we'll get onto that trip and that interview and what exactly happened then in a second. But I think for me, one of the most compelling things about the series and working on it, and one of the most fun things actually when it comes to writing a series like this, is the fact that we started knowing that we had two kind of ready-made characters. This guy was a clear character, and then there was a second man, a man called Special Agent Dennis Bass, who was a Baltimore special agent who ended up chasing this German guy around the world for decades. And I suppose, firstly, could you tell us a little bit about those two men, but also what you found so interesting about them and why it's so useful for podcast creators like ourselves to find ourselves, faced with these two ready-made characters?
Yeah, I think it's an absolute dream narratively to have these two kind of men pitted against each other. One that seems to largely represent the side of good and law enforcement and order, and the other one that was, I think, in some ways he quite liked the idea of himself as an evil genius getting away with stuff. And Special Agent Dennis Bass is this Baltimore cop, think Scorsese style, the movie Heat or something like that. He's got this amazing Baltimore accent, and he was an incredibly clever customs special agent. And I never think of customs agents as particularly sexy, but this guy's role was really cool. He would do these amazing sting operations. So he found a big chemical shipment going somewhere in the Middle East, and it was clearly very, very dodgy. He could have just seized it then and there, but he would never have found out who was behind it and where it was going. So he did this incredible operation. In the middle of the night, he went down to Baltimore Harbor, and they got several big containers worth of barrels of liquid. And they swapped out all the chemicals for water in the middle of the night without anybody realizing what was happening. And then the shipment left the next day, and over a period of a couple of months, this is before trackers and GPS and all of this, they followed this shipment around the world and found that it was actually bound for Iran, which was very, very illegal. And then they found who had bought the chemicals, this man, Peter Walaszczak in Germany, and Special Agent Bass did the sting operation, where he got the company that had sold him the chemicals to invite him to America, all expenses paid trip. And when he landed, he was arrested. But no matter what Special Agent did, no matter how clever and wily he was over the years in arresting both Peter Walaszczak and another chemical weapons industry dealer, it just seemed to always go against him. However clever he was, things were stacked against him, whether it was extradition agreements or court decisions. These men would just slip through his clutches. And in fact, 3 times Peter Walaszczak was arrested, and 3 times he got away with it. And poor Special Agent Bass, all these years, has been hoping to get Peter Walaszczak behind bars, and he's never managed it. And then on the other side, you have Peter Walaszczak, who escapes and lands back in Germany, where there is no extradition agreement with America, so it's impossible to touch him. And he calls Special Agent Bass back in the States and says, ha, 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 you can't catch me. And so he rubs it in his face. And like I say, he likes to think of himself as a bit of an evil genius. It was a very unlucky thing for Special Agent Bass that Peter Walaszczak was let out on bail, and he called his Iranian handlers who got him a fake passport, and he skipped bail that way. And so having these 2 great characters who are kind of absolute arch enemies was really helpful narratively to get us through the series.
And I would actually say one of the slightly difficult things for making a series like this is there were so many twists and turns that you end up having to cut out these amazing, we had, these scenes that we were so fascinated by, but you just have to cut them because you can't follow that many twists and turns. There's only so many escapes, there's only so many sting operations that you can kind of fit into a series. And that moment when they speak to each other on the phone several times, and we do mention it throughout the series, and it's just amazing. As someone writing an episode, it's an amazing narrative moment to be kind of gifted that you have your kind of main characters actually crossing paths in real life. And so the series, we set out with the kind of question, the kind of guiding investigative question of how did this guy get away with it, which was kind of one thread of the investigation that we looked into. And as you said, there's kind of legal elements to that, there's extradition and things like that. But I suppose, what were the other threads that we pulled out in terms of investigation that we ended up with after kind of the 6 episodes and the months of reporting?
So what was really interesting about this character was, we went to Germany not really knowing what he'd been doing for 30 years since he'd got away with selling these very dodgy chemicals. We should say these chemicals were ordered by Iran to be used in the processing and making of mustard gas, which is a very, very, very nasty chemical weapon. It often maims people horrifically, and they spend decades living with horrific illnesses, and eventually they might die 20, 30 years later from their ailments. It's a very, very nasty chemical. And we hadn't known what this man, Peter Walaszczak, had done in the intervening years, and we started digging into it. And he was very, very helpful in filling us in that he'd continued doing business with Iran, lots of business with Iran, but he'd also branched out to countries that he liked to refer to as the axis of evil. So he was doing business with North Korea and taking trips to Pyongyang and with China and Cuba and basically anywhere that hated America. That's where he would go and do business. And the more we dug, the more we found, and eventually we found that he'd been arrested again in Germany this time, or not arrested, caught by customs in Germany, trying to export to Iran a substance which is known colloquially as truth serum, because it's used often in torture interrogations in order to try and extract information. It can also be used when people are found guilty, capital punishment, and they're put to death by lethal injection. So it's illegal actually to export to any country that has capital punishment from Europe, and he had tried to send this substance to Iran and been caught. But he was pretty open about talking to us about his trade with these other countries and what it was like traveling to these places. And then we also started digging beyond Peter Valaszczak and found that lots of countries around the world have also been involved, both in arming Iran and Iraq. Britain was also responsible for arming Iraq during that conflict in the 80s, when Iranian citizens particularly suffered from the effects of chemical weapons. A British company built a chemical weapons factory in Fallujah in Iraq, and that very same chemical weapons factory was then used by the British government as a reason to go to war against Iraq. And then we wonder why they don't like us very much. And so there were lots and lots of countries around the world that helped arm people during that war and also subsequent wars. And in fact, looking to what's happening now, there are still machine parts and industry, useful industry bits and bobs that go to third-party countries from Europe, where there is no ban. These countries are not sanctioned because they're third-party countries, but then they go from there to Russia. So we have a policy where, we're against what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but surreptitiously we're actually helping to arm a lot of these countries. And Germany, in particular, has been accused of arming both Iran and Iraq, and also now helping to arm Russia through its very, very large industry.
And I would say that that's one of the things that was most surprising to me, is that you've reported quite extensively on chemical weapons, but this was new territory for me, and the kind of involvement, or the scale of involvement of people as middlemen, but also, which is what this series particularly focuses on, which is the middlemen and the kind of people that are maybe wearing the business suits and making the deals and kind of pressing the yes and signing the checks, and then think that, that's them done. They made their money. They're not responsible for what happens. And to me, that was what was so compelling about the series, was this idea that you can be involved in something and not feel responsible for where your kind of chemicals end up and what they're involved in. But also, as you say, the kind of companies and the governments and the kind of bigger structural involvement in these kind of trades was something to me that was totally new. I think we should probably talk about our interview with Peter Valaszczak, who's the German man, and what happened there, because we both went to Germany knowing that we thought this was an important story and one that we wanted to investigate, but not necessarily knowing that it would be more than a single documentary, not necessarily knowing that it would be a 6-part series. And it was that interview, I think, which really confirmed it for both of us, that this was something that we needed to look into, and this was something that couldn't necessarily be told in 45 minutes. So can you tell us about that and what that was like for you, and maybe I'll say what it was like for me as well.
So, I think it's quite hard to have a documentary series, 6 episodes, with a man in his 80s sustaining it. I was thinking, is he going to be, is he going to be that interesting? Is he going to have that much to say? And we arrived at his home, and he took us into his office, which is just above his house. And the first thing we noticed when we walked through the door was an absolutely enormous portrait of Stalin right in the entrance. I was like, okay. We go up the stairs. There's a massive portrait of Chairman Mao with the Chinese workers below, like that. And we walk into his office, and along one wall was just all these busts of former Soviet leaders and dictators. And then there was something else. There was this chanting playing, music. He had Buddhist chants on, and he was dressed in this orange robe. And it turns out that Peter Valaszczak, in the last couple of years of his life, at the age of 80, has decided he is now a Buddhist. So whenever we would ask him about, do you feel bad about these deals that you did in the past? He would always say, I never asked what these chemicals were for. I never asked what they were about. And we would say, but now, knowing everything you know, do you feel bad? And he would say, you don't understand. I'm a Buddhist. I live in the present. I have no past. Which was a very, very useful pivot. And he also had, very interestingly, on the walls, old icons, Christian Orthodox icons. And so I asked him about them, and he said, oh yes, before I became a Buddhist, I was a Christian, and he pointed at one particular icon, this beautifully gilded picture of Jesus, and he said, oh yes, Jesus always looks down at me very angry when I'm on my laptop. And I said, oh, because of all the Buddhist chanting and stuff? And he said, no, because I'm watching pornography. And I think at this point we realized this man was not your average Buddhist. And so we thought, you know, there's stuff to dig into here. Maybe this will sustain 6 episodes.
Yeah, and also involved a trip to Wimbledon, Buddhist Thai temple, to understand actually where he might be right and where he might be wrong in his understanding of the faith and how it relates to your past and to history. And we should say that he obviously denies knowledge of what he was involved in. But I think for us, the kind of compelling element of that interview actually was how open he was about his involvement in the story as he wanted to tell it. So he was, you know, bursting to tell us about his escape and his kind of trickery, and, you know, he has all these, you know, he's a man who kind of speaks in quotes. So he had these kind of phrases, you know, a good American is a dead American. And, you know, the FBI, they're so stupid. That's how I was able to get away. That's how I was able to escape. And so he was very happy to talk to us about those elements of the kind of plot, I suppose, that he felt proud of, and then just would not engage with us on the kind of complicated questioning. And I think part of the reason was that it's been however many decades since this happened. This is something that to him happened in the past. But the reality is, and what the kind of investigation and the reporting revealed to us is, firstly, this is not something that the people who were involved in mustard gas on the receiving end from Iraq, the other side of the war, the Iranians, they have not been able to, this is not from the 80s, this is something that impacts their life on a daily basis. Particularly, you know, we spoke to a lot of Kurdish people who were involved in this, who are living with the ramifications of chemical warfare. And they cannot, in the same way that these kind of middlemen have been able to say, well, this happened a long time ago, they cannot do that. And I also think that from your reporting, you kind of, we started looking at the 80s and we ended up actually looking at chemical weapons programs in the current day, which to me was a very surprising kind of element for it to take on.
It was surprising to me. So I started, when I looked at this, I thought, well, does Iran, I know that Iran tried to develop chemical weapons at the end of the war, and that's why they ordered this particular chemical from Peter Valaszczak. And I started looking into it, and I found that Iran had admitted that it had developed chemical weapons at the end of the war in the late 80s, but then claimed it had got rid of them. And I was asking around, you know, does Iran have chemical weapons today? And lots of people said, well, you know, maybe, but there's no evidence. And then I really started digging into it, and I started speaking to national security advisors, and found that actually there is some evidence out there that Iran does have a chemical weapons program, an active chemical weapons program. Particularly America has been talking about this for quite a while, that this is, and also Israel, who is afraid of being on the receiving end of Iran's chemical weapons industry. Both countries have been shouting about this for a while, and it seems everybody has been very focused on the nuclear issue. Nobody has really paid much attention to the fact that Iran does seem to have been developing a chemical weapons program, which, interestingly enough, is not the old-fashioned mustard gases of the 1980s, but is a pharmaceutical-based chemical weapons program. If anybody remembers Moscow in the early 2000s, there was a siege by Chechnyan rebels in a Moscow theater, and the authorities went in, the special forces, Russian special forces went in and pumped this theater with about 1,000 people in it, full of this sleeping gas, which later transpired to be fentanyl. If you heard of the pharmaceutical that's ravaging America, this was turned into a gas by the Russians, pumped into this theater, and they put everybody to sleep, managed to shoot the terrorists that had taken everyone hostage, but a lot of the hostages, about 130 hostages, just never woke up. It's very, very dangerous stuff. And so Iran is developing these pharmaceutical-based chemical weapons. And I went to an Iranian specialist and said, well, do you think Iran would ever use these kinds of weapons? And he said, well, maybe if they feel cornered. And I thought, well, given what's going on in the Middle East right now, maybe we should be worried about this. And so we looked into that, and it was quite a revelation to us, I think, that this is going on right now, and that there doesn't seem to be very much beyond diplomatic pressure that can be done about it. And it involves middlemen, again, working today to get these kinds of pharmaceuticals to Iran.